All right, I think we'll get going, and if other people jump on, we will certainly let them in on the call. So again, my name is Matt Kinzera. I'm the executive director of Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice, where we try to connect people of faith with causes of justice, and we do that in a number of different ways. And we have a history of fighting for the rights of our trans community in Wisconsin and Dane County. In the past, we've been a part of the Transgender Day of Remembrance Interfaith Services. However, over the last 2 years, there's been a concern over safety for obvious reasons, so we have not held that service. So we've been looking for other ways to support those who want to support our trans community, our LGBTQ plus and queer community across Wisconsin. And recently was connected with Fair Wisconsin, although I've known of their work for many, many years, and was directed to Cait and Mallery because of their incredible work that they've just started doing this year on really the narrative around what we're hearing about the trans community. And that's what we're here to learn about today. And so Cait Mallery is an organizer, communicator, and facilitator who comes to Fair Wisconsin from a background in reproductive rights, justice, and abolitionist organizing. They are passionate about issues of gender, justice, and health equality, and particularly enjoy working across intersecting movements for equity to build collective power. In their free time, Cait enjoys baking, especially for others. So if you really get to know them, you never know what's possible. And road trips, which I think a lot of us share that. I do want to say, as somebody who's done presentations on Zoom before, if you're available and if you're comfortable, if you don't mind putting your screen on, it is much more enjoyable to present to faces than to a black box with a name. That being said, if you're in a space where you don't feel comfortable with that, we're just thankful that you're here. So with that said, I'll pass it over to Cait. Thank you for being here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen really quickly. And thank you to you all for being here. Okay, fantastic. Can folks see my screen? Wonderful. I see a thumbs up, some nods. Excellent. So, as was mentioned, my name is Cait Mallery, they, them pronouns. I'm on Fair Wisconsin's organizing team. For folks who may not have heard of Fair Wisconsin or who may be newer to our work, we are Wisconsin's only statewide LGBTQ political advocacy and civic engagement group, which means that we do a little bit of a whole lot of stuff. Things like getting out the vote for key elections, such as today. Don't forget to go vote if you haven't yet. Um, Showing up at and supporting people in telling their stories at the state house, especially when it comes to anti-trans bills, as we've seen a number of them for the past few years, fighting for conversion therapy bans in cities and counties throughout Wisconsin, and really just trying to connect with folks around the state to offer resources and support people in sharing their stories. So this training, talking about trans rights, messages to move people, is going to guide us through a little bit of how to have conversations with folks about trans rights, how to wade through some of the difficult conversational topics that come up, and then a little bit about the framework of what it means to change minds. So to jump right in here, the big ideas behind this training are first, that personal story is by far the most effective thing when it comes to changing people's minds. Second, each of us has a story that includes trans folks, our friends and family members, but it also includes anyone who is, an educator or an athlete or a faith leader or a potluck host or a community member across the board. Every one of us has a story. Of us has a stake in moving towards a future where trans folks can live freely and in community. And finally, we are often the most effective storytellers in reaching our friends and neighbors. As I mentioned, Fair Wisconsin travels around the state a fair amount. We talk to folks in different corners and in different spaces. And, we have trainings and toolkits and all of the things to try to foster communication. But when it comes down to it, you all are the most effective storytellers, really, when it comes to having communications that change people's minds, whether that's our friends, our neighbors, our book clubs, our faith communities, the person next to us at the grocery store. You all within your communities are most effective there. So this training is designed to start laying the groundwork for you and your communities to have conversations about trans rights in a way that moves people and really start to dig into the idea that what works isn't hitting people over the head with statistics or numbers, but narrative change and a story that's personal to each one of us. part of this involves thinking about why each of us is in this work or in this space, and why each of us is bothering to have these kinds of difficult or tricky conversations with our friends and neighbors and strangers. So I'm talking a lot about stories. So just to model super briefly a little bit of what this has looked like for me, kind of understanding that it's really important for each of us to be able to model the same vulnerability that we're asking of others, that I'm asking for you all in talking to strangers. A little bit about myself and my background. I grew up as part of a relatively small evangelical community in Southern California, and I didn't actually know any trans people in person until I went off to college, or at least I didn't know that I knew any trans people. When I realized very suddenly that, oh, this is an option. This is a way that people are living their lives, and that I can live my life as well. My community growing up was generally kind of tolerant of the existence of LGBTQ folks, but there wasn't a ton of awareness, and there was a lot of hesitancy around issues that people didn't necessarily feel that they had context for, which is a perspective that I hear a lot from folks across Wisconsin and nationally. And so, what brings me to this kind of narrative change work with Fair Wisconsin and doing advocacy around trans rights is thinking about how many people I know that are still in that space of uncertainty, or maybe being curious or not necessarily having a strong position in either direction. These people that I love and care about while simultaneously don't always feel safe with necessarily. So we're going to be spending a few minutes in this training identifying our own sense of, again, why we might be called to have these conversations, what our personal experience is around trans rights. And I also want to emphasize briefly that this model of identifying your stake in this work is very transferable to other forms of organizing, other topics as well. So to go over super briefly our general overview here, we are going to start off with a general overview of the state of trans rights today in the state of Wisconsin, as well as nationally. We're going to move into this question of how exactly do we move people? I've been saying the word story and narrative change a fair amount, so digging into that a little bit more. We're going to go over some general best practice messaging tactics, which are things like what are some key ideas and principles you can lean back on when you are having conversations with folks or trying to bridge a gap between you and the person you're having a conversation with. We're then going to move into a broader issue overview, which is going to specifically dive into a handful of topics and how specifically to talk about trans healthcare, trans athletes, curriculum censorship, things like that. And then finally, not on this slide, but we're going to move into a short practice round where we're going to be practicing a little bit of what it looks like to draw out and identify our own stories in conversation. This training is, just as on the logistical side of things, going to run for a little under an hour, and we will have some time for questions at the end. Please do feel free to drop any questions in the chat as they may come up. I'll also be sending slides out after the fact, as well as any resources that were mentioned or related to specific questions. So please feel free to be present in the way that feels best for you, and don't feel the need to take meticulous notes on every part of the presentation. All right, moving into that general overview about where are we now. There are around 12.7 thousand trans youth in the state of Wisconsin, which is 3.3% of youth in the state. If you think about the number of kids in a middle school classroom, I know for me there were around 30 in mine. That's around one kid in each classroom. And I just want to emphasize here that trans youth are in every community in Wisconsin. They're in big towns, small towns. Trans youth are everywhere, even if we don't always know it. Similarly, there are 35.8 thousand trans adults in the state of Wisconsin, which is 0.8% of adults in the state. I know that when I start talking about statistics and really big numbers, everything gets a little bit fuzzy for me. So another point of comparison here might be thinking about the number of people you know who are natural redheads, which is around 1% of the population. So if you think about the number of natural redheads you know, or that may be in your community, or within the spaces that you're moving through in person, that's similar statistics there. I will also note that these are almost certainly undercounts, just given the fact that a lot of trans folks don't necessarily feel comfortable identifying themselves as trans in national surveys and things like that. So, and yet, despite the fact that we know that trans young people and trans adults are present in every community in Wisconsin, 70% of adults believe that they've never met a trans person before. Again, like myself when I was growing up. And I will highlight the word believe here because it is very, very unlikely that none of us have met a trans person, but we don't always know when we're meeting someone that they are trans. There's a old statistic from 2015 that I like to highlight here, which found that more Americans believed that they had met a ghost than that they'd ever met a trans person. Now, obviously, that is a pretty outdated statistic at this point, and trans people have become increasingly more visible over the past decade. But I use that example to kind of ground us in the fact that even today, a lot of folks receiving anti-trans messaging, hearing these talking points, seeing harmful ads, seeing misinformation, may not know that they've ever met a trans person before. And specifically, there's a lot of transformative potential when it comes to hearing someone's story for the first time. One of the results of this high percentage of people believing that they've never met a trans person before, or trans people just not being very visible in public life, is that nationally in 2025, there were 1,020 anti-trans bills proposed across the country, which is an over 500% increase from 2021. So we are absolutely seeing an increase in bills specifically targeting trans folks, especially targeting trans young people. In the state of Wisconsin, we did not see 1,000, but we did definitely see a handful of specifically anti-trans bills, including several that passed in both chambers and were vetoed by the governor before they could come into effect. So that's a bit of a depressing statistic. The good news here, if there is good news, is that although the other side is quite loud in their beliefs in person and on social media, many people don't have strong opinions about transgender people in either direction. And this doesn't necessarily mean that we have the majority behind fighting anti-trans laws, but it does mean that there is a lot of room to change people's minds in and have conversations. The other piece of good news is that this wave, that 500% increase that I mentioned, is very much not permanent. The history of explicitly anti-trans legislation in the US begins mostly, though not entirely, in 2016. Our current national landscape around trans rights is very much not permanent. It was manufactured, and that means that we can break it down. So how do we move people? What does it look like to break down that national landscape on a one-on-one level? This is where we get to this concept of narrative change. There have been really large amounts of money and time and energy. Some of you might have seen some harmful ads over the past few months or few years around trans people. Really large amounts of money and time and energy invested in what I sometimes refer to as kind of fear narratives around trans people by the right. But particularly for the large numbers of people without a strong opinion in either direction, folks that maybe haven't ever met a trans person in person or don't know that they've met a trans person in person, these narratives don't necessarily hold up when faced with stories and people. And statistically, talking to people is what changes their minds. I want to share a short video here, which is from a bill hearing back in March of 2025. This was a bill that would have banned gender affirming care for trans youth in the state of Wisconsin. The man that you're about to hear from is an 85-year-old out of Milwaukee named Larry. He drove to the state capitol, sat through several hours of hearing people testify before him, before finally getting to his point of testimony. I'm realizing that I may not have shared my audio, so I'm going to stop sharing super briefly. Hello again, and go ahead and reshare with my sound. Wonderful. Okay.
So, all right, Larry, the floor is yours. You got 2 minutes.
First of all, I'd like to apologize to you people. I was invited here to give my support for Bill 401. I have very little knowledge of gay people and things like that there. So when I came here, my eyes were open. I was one of the critics that sat on the side and made the decisions there was only two genders. So I got an education that was unbelievable. And I don't know just exactly how to say this, but my perspective for people have changed. So I don't want to take up no more of your time. I'd like to apologize for being here, and I learned a very lot about this group of people.
All right.
I really appreciate Larry. A couple things I want to highlight there are Larry did not know a lot about trans people when he showed up. He was not someone who I would quantify as being in the middle or being uncertain when he drove from Milwaukee to Madison and sat through several hours of testimony. Um, and yet, he may not know all of the language at the end of the session. He may not have a list of statistics memorized. But what happened was that over the course of several hours, over the course of hearing from trans young people, families, community members in this room, he the power of those stories really did shift his perspective. And obviously, we can't sit down with every person who is uncertain about or against trans rights and tell stories for several consecutive hours at them. That would be a whole lot of people and a whole lot of time. But I highlight this example as a way of pointing to the fact that there is a lot of potential in stories, in hearing from people, and that is something that every one of us has the power to share about. So thinking about having conversations with folks, thinking about what it looks like to actually dive into having difficult conversations, I'm going to offer again some broad messaging here, some broad messaging tactics here, or things to keep in mind in the back of your head, with the understanding that, as with all kind of messaging toolkits, there is no one size fits all. Different people respond better to different messages. And although these are general best practice, in one-on-one conversations within your community, you know the person that you're talking to best. And so first point here is around leading with shared values and finding the shared value with the person that you're having a conversation with. For some people, that might be the shared value of freedom of speech. For some people, it might be this language of bodily autonomy. For some people, it might be teamwork or belonging. And in a lot of spaces, unless you're talking to a complete stranger with no context, you might have a little bit of a clue going in as to what kinds of messaging or what kinds of values the person you're talking with already has in mind. So for myself, for example, I grew up in a faith community, as mentioned, that had really strong values around teamwork and around hard work in service of a broader whole. And so those might be the values and the language that I would lean into when having a conversation with someone in my faith community growing up about trans athletes, for example, and the ability of trans athletes to work hard in service of the broader team goal and to build up those skills. I also point to shared values because although it is very tempting to lead with the problem, lead with the things that we're upset about, in a lot of cases, when we're having conversations with people, leading with a shared value is more successful than leading with a problem in specifically moving people to action. So rather than framing the conversation around there are attacks on our community and we want them to stop, although that is going to be some of the conversations we're having, certainly, it is sometimes useful to instead lean on the language of, painting a better future here by highlighting that what it is that we're moving towards, whether that is healthcare for all, the ability to find community, etc. Let's see. Another point I will point to here as a broad messaging tactic to hold on to keep in mind during these conversations, is that fact checking and what's sometimes called countering, which is finding a specific point that's made and immediately countering it, doesn't necessarily work at the start of a conversation. That doesn't mean that there isn't a point in the conversation for fact checking, for specifically pointing to numbers and data and information that you have on hand. However, when you're first starting to have a conversation with someone, hitting them with statistics, hitting them with hard facts is going to be very difficult to shift someone's perspective around. Instead, some of the tactics that we want to lean into are first or earlier on, establishing a personal connection. I was recently in Missouri deep canvassing with a group that is doing some educational work around an upcoming anti-trans ballot measure. And what they find there is that the most successful storytellers, when it comes to knocking on a stranger's door, having a conversation about trans rights, in those spaces, it has often been specifically parents of trans young people, And that's in part because of their ability to make connections with other parents. They are identifying, hey, we both have a shared stake in wanting the best for our kids and establishing that personal connection. I heard from one parent who said, I had a really great conversation with someone who didn't know a lot about trans people, but we both have 6-year-old kids. And so that was a really great personal connection for us. Additionally, refocusing on your values if you get a little bit lost in the conversation. And finally, remembering that it is okay not to be an expert. Um, Even myself, as someone who's been working at Fair Wisconsin for the past 2.5 years, there's a lot of the numbers and the statistics and the current state of policy nationally that I may not have on hand. But we don't need to have all of the numbers on hand, to have all of the statistics on hand, to know that we want, we want trans youth to be able to find community, to know that we think the government shouldn't be able to ban healthcare just because they don't agree with it. And it really is okay not to be an expert going into every conversation you're having. Additionally, part of why we don't focus on fact checking before building an emotional connection is really understanding that, transition to the next slide here, people often believe misinformation because it aligns with beliefs that they're already holding or a kind of internal sense of discomfort. And facts won't necessarily get them to move off of that point. If you've ever had a conversation with someone who has seen a piece of misinformation on Fox News or on social media, or they've heard it from their uncle, it can be really frustrating sometimes as you are maybe listing statistics and numbers and facts, and it's really not getting them to budge at all sometimes. And that's because, again, when someone hears misinformation, a lot of the time, what gets them to grab onto that piece of misinformation is not a kind of rational and calm assessment of the facts and uh, a peer-reviewed study and looking at the list of citations that Fox News has provided, but rather it is this internal sense of discomfort or fear or anger or not understanding something and finding finding pieces of information, finding pieces of specifically misinformation that align with that perspective. And so again, because there is that emotional connection before there is any hard and concrete facts that people are weighing, the emotional connection is where we need to move first in order to have effective conversations with folks. Okay, so we've gone over some broader messaging tactics, which are the ideas for us to keep in mind as we're having conversations. I want to move now into having a few conversations around the specifics of trans healthcare, trans athletes, and curriculum censorship. So when we're talking about trans healthcare, for example, where does resistance come from? There are a few places where people are often kind of hesitant or leaning into preconceived notions coming into these conversations. And the first one is just not knowing what transgender healthcare is. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and talking about bodies and surgery in general tends to make people uncomfortable. This is part of where story sharing and talking about one's own experience with healthcare and the medical system for either trans folks comfortable sharing or people who have trans people in their lives can be really helpful in moving these experiences out of the abstract and into the same realm in which people think about their own experiences with the medical system. Additionally, when we talk about trans healthcare for youth, anytime we're talking about young people and their right to bodily autonomy, we're automatically brushing up against kind of pre-existing cultural narratives and conversations around young people, especially when it comes to the ability of young people to make their own decisions. And we see this when we look at curriculum censorship, for example. Finally, a big point that comes up actually when we're thinking about trans healthcare and where people have hesitancies or where people are having resistance coming from is thinking of transgender healthcare as somehow optional or extra healthcare when they themselves can't afford or access basic healthcare. And this comes out of a sense of scarcity that is partially being manufactured here to create the sense that we need to be fighting amongst ourselves for scraps. And what works here, as we'll get into on future slides as well, is really leaning into what I like to call an abundance narrative. And that is that we want trans people to have health care, knowing that it is medically necessary, knowing that it is life-saving care, and we want you to have health care as well. I personally, in conversations with folks, I talk about my own challenges accessing healthcare because I know that other people have similar frustrations with things like insurance and the way that external forces decide what we can and can't do with our bodies. And these are very much overlapping fights. Going a little bit into the context here, um, we know, for example, that trans healthcare is life-saving healthcare for transgender people of all ages. Statistically, this is care that dramatically reduces rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide, as well as increases access to care in other areas as well. When you're having positive experiences with the medical system or experiences that feel affirming, you are much more likely to, for example, also go in to get screened for cancer. You are much more likely to access other forms of care that you need. Trans healthcare is also not a single category of services, but is instead a range of services, including mental health care, medical care, and social services. And additionally, it is approved by every major medical association in the US. Moving into or thinking a little bit about messages that work. Um, and these are some broad messages, but please do feel free to adapt things a little bit to use your own words. I definitely have, canvassed or been in spaces where there is a specific script that I'm supposed to stick to very, very strictly. And I want you to feel comfortable to use your own words and your own language while leaning back on these principles. So some general messages that work are healthcare decisions should be made by trans youth and the family and doctors in the room making decisions together, not politicians. Additionally, it is dangerous when the government is allowed to selectively ban care that they don't like. And we see the ways that this is already impacting people accessing healthcare across the board. People who are on Medicare or Medicaid, for example, but also anyone accessing care more broadly. When I'm actually when I'm thinking about trans people and trans young people's access to healthcare, I actually think a lot about my dad, funnily enough, who is not trans and is a cis straight white man who works as a professor, so is not necessarily subject to the same kind of broader level attacks that are specific to his identities. And also, he still faces restrictions on his ability to access the kind of care that he knows would be best for him as well, because he's diabetic and his insurance company has decided that it won't cover the medication that would be more effective for him and his body. And I think a lot of us have stories along these lines or stories similar to this, where some external force, whether it's a doctor, whether it's our parents when we're younger, whether it's insurance companies or politicians, have decided for ourselves that we are not the decision makers when it comes to our own body and our own health care. Finally, as a message that works when it comes to talking about trans healthcare, again, leaning into the language of abundance, and that is everyone deserves the right to access the healthcare that they need. We want trans young people to have access to healthcare. Um, we want factors like, again, insurance companies or politicians to not be able to decide arbitrarily what kind of healthcare they approve of and don't approve of, because we want that both for trans young people and we want that for you as well. I want to be able to access care without other people deciding that they know what's best for me and my body. I'm going to move here into talking a little bit about curriculum censorship and schools as well. These are things like book bans, but also what are sometimes called forced outing policies, which would require that that teachers share with parents when young people are going by a different name or different pronouns or asking questions about gender or identity, understanding that we want everyone to feel safe at home. And also we know that not every home is a safe place for young people to talk about or explore identity. So where does resistance come from when we're talking about young people in schools? First, all of this gets caught up in pre-existing narratives around young people and youth autonomy and a broader distrust of youth about their own ability to make decisions about themselves. Additionally, this comes as part of a wave of censorship that we see nationally, book bans, curriculum censorship, as well as a broader distrust of teachers, and finally, attacks on public education and attempts to privatize education. So when we see attacks on trans youth in schools, when we see attacks on the ability of teachers to support trans youth, that is part of a broader distrust of teachers and a broader erosion of the public education system as a whole. The context that we know about trans young people, about schools, are that, first of all, censorship does not make youth any safer. And in fact, not having access to affirming and accurate information about yourself, about the communities that exist around you, is statistically less likely to support people in making healthy decisions for themselves. Additionally, as mentioned, we are seeing a wave of censorship nationally around both LGBTQ and racial justice issues. For example, when we look at book bans, there is quite a lot of overlap in the titles of books that are being banned, which are around LGBTQ issues or feature LGBTQ characters and that talk about racial justice issues. And so when we're talking about one of these issues, it is really important for us to be able to talk about both at once, understanding that our fights are interconnected here. And additionally, when we're talking about curriculum censorship and schools, really important to highlight or to understand that this advocacy that we see in the news is quite frequently led not by a grassroots base or a majority of parents, but rather by out-of-state lobbying groups or far-right activists or one or two individual parents who are very, very vocal. There was a parent in a Wisconsin school district, I forget the specific school district, but a couple of years ago that individually challenged over 400 books. And so, although it can appear, again, that these kinds of fights or challenges are coming from a massive wave of grassroots parents, that one person does not represent the opinions of a lot of parents in their district. And when we see these book bans, when we see individual parents trying to make decisions on behalf of every family in their district, that is taking away autonomy both from these young people's ability to access affirming information about themselves, but also from the families that want their kids to be able to access this kind of information in a school environment. Finally, and here we're leaning back on shared values and shared principles here. Some of the messages that work when we're having conversations around curriculum censorship are, for example, freedom of speech, freedom from censorship, and finally, trusting teachers over politicians. When we use the word politicians, I often find that that opens up a lot of conversational doors because very few people like politicians as an abstract concept. And so when we think about who do we want to trust here, do we want to trust the teachers and the people that are in the rooms with our kids and working hard every day to ensure that young people have access to the resources and the information that they need? Or do we want to trust the politicians that are not in these rooms, that don't know that much about our kids? That is potentially a shared point of connection, especially with parents. And finally, I want to highlight here, let's talk a little bit about trans athletes. So where does resistance come from when we're having conversations about trans athletes and trans folks in sports? The first point is sexism and racism are both points that we see come up a lot around trans athletes and trans people in sports. These are traditional ideas of what girls, quote unquote, should look like. And I highlight here that Black cisgender women and girls are often targeted in attacks on trans athletes as well, kind of getting caught in the crossfire there. Resistance, as kind of an extension of that sexism, attacks on trans athletes are often very much denying agency to cis or cisgender, non-trans women and girls as well. Um, this can be really disempowering of these girls and using them as rhetorical props and used as a talking point, when in reality, we know that it is far from universal that cis women and girls are uncomfortable with playing on the same team as their trans teammates. And yet this language is used absent of their presence and absent of their voices, with the exception of a few very loud spokespeople. And finally, resistance can sometimes come from the fact that, as with that 70% statistic, there are very few public examples of transgender athletes. So a lot of people don't know what it means to be trans or what it means to be a trans athlete. Moving into the context a little bit here, so transgender athletes are currently very, very rare. The NCAA president, Charlie Baker, testified in December of 2024 that he knows of fewer than 10 transgender college student athletes, and that's among about 510,000, so about 500,000 athletes total. And I point this out not because those 10 athletes don't also deserve the ability to thrive and learn about teamwork and build community in the same ways as their non-trans peers, but because it becomes super clear when we look at those numbers that anti-trans anxiety comes out of broader fears and biases that people have about gender rather than specific instances within specific communities that people are seeing in most cases. Additionally, we know that trans athletes have been around for decades prior to becoming a massively controversial topic or a point that we see coming up in the news cycle or in political advertisements. What we've seen over the past 5 or 10 years when we're talking about trans athletes has really been anti-equality activists throwing a whole bunch of spaghetti at the wall in terms of trying to figure out what issues might be controversial, trying to figure out what issues people might latch onto, and trans athletes being a point or a topic that has really stuck in a lot of ways. And that is, again, because a lot of people just don't know that much about trans people. A lot of people don't know that much about trans athletes. And so there's a lot of room in the absence of knowing a trans person or knowing that you know a trans person in your community for misinformation and bias to grow. A couple additional points of context here are that girls' involvement in sports, and that is both cis and trans girls, actually decreases in states with trans athlete bans. So we know that building supportive environments for girls to participate in sports, to participate in sports teams, regardless of whether or not they are cis or trans, builds a more supportive environment across the board. One of the reasons for this might be that there is no way to exclude trans athletes from sports without making invasive testing and examinations standard practice. And if you are having conversations already in your community about things like sexual violence and sexual harassment, there might be room here as well to talk about the way that this kind of policy of excluding trans athletes from sports just further re-entrenches a kind of systemic sexual harassment that is already very common within sports. Finally, moving into the messages that work section. On this first point here, sports develops collaboration, dedication, teamwork, hard work, etc. Here we're finding shared values, so substitute the shared values that work for you and your community. And trans kids should be able to access and develop these interpersonal skills too. And again, on this first point, I want to encourage you to build here on the conversations that you might already be having. So if you know that your community really values dedication and perseverance as values, that might be a useful parallel to make. Again, I mentioned the faith community I grew up in really values hard work in service of others. So that might be language that I would use in this specific context. Additionally, a message that works in this space is that the government shouldn't perform invasive examinations and testing just so someone can participate in a sports league. And finally, we all deserve the resources to thrive and find community, and access to education shouldn't depend on scholarships. This is a specific response to a point that I hear being made sometimes around sports, which is this concern that trans women and girls are somehow taking away scholarships from cis women and girls, which, first of all, is not something that happens. And given, again, the incredibly, incredibly small number of trans women and girls that are participating as athletes in the public sphere right now. But additionally, when we run into these conversations around this language of taking away scholarships, if we built up a sense of support or are having a deeper conversation with someone, that might be a useful point to pivot and say, and question this idea that young people should have to compete for scholarships in order to access education more broadly. And that is, again, leaning into the language of abundance. We want good things for trans people. We want trans people to be free from systemic oppression. And we also want good things for everyone in our community. All right, so this is the point where I would love to encourage us to practice a little bit. I apologize for not checking in with Matt and Jill about this earlier. Sometimes when I'm doing this section, I will put folks in breakout rooms. I'm happy to do that or happy to have a broader group discussion since I think there aren't too many of us. Matt, is there a preference on that side of things?
I would just do the broader group discussion with our smaller group here.
Wonderful. Cool. All right, so this is the point where we are starting to think about what our story is and starting to think about how we build conversations with people when it comes to sharing our stories. So I would love to ask folks, and feel free to come off of mute, feel free to type in the chat, raise your hand, whatever feels good for you. When you were a kid, what was a time that you felt like you really belonged, or a time when you didn't, and what shaped that experience? And I'll kind of start for myself to model very briefly what this might look like. Um, I was a part of a youth orchestra when I was younger. And one thing that made me feel like I really belonged in that space was I don't know if anyone else here has played violin or that kind of genre of string instruments. Um, Violin does not sound good for the first, I would say, year that you're learning it. It's very high pitched. There's some screechy noises. Um, or at least for me, maybe everyone else is actually much better at it than me. Um, but what made me feel like I belonged in that space was being able to learn and grow and be imperfect and make noises that did not always sound the best. And I would love to ask for other folks in the room, are there times that you felt like you really belonged or didn't when you were a kid?
I can talk. I went to a little one-room country school, and I was not a sports kind of kid. So I was always picked last to be on people's teams, which did not feel good. But I excelled in things like we had a something called YCL, Young Citizens League, and so I was president of that, and I could run meetings and be a class leader or a school leader, but nothing to do with sports.
The ability to run meetings is definitely a very underrated skill, and agreed on the sports part there. Um, Other stories from folks about places you felt like you belonged or places you felt like you didn't?
I'll share, similar to you, Cait, music had a lot to do with my feeling safe or feeling like I belonged. In middle school, I was a new kid at the school, so it was hard to meet friends and all of that kind of stuff. And when I got involved with the band program, that band room just felt like this safe space apart from the hallways of the school, where there was a lot of people who liked the same kind of things as I did, and so it just felt like this safe space that I didn't have to be around as many people who I didn't always understand. So
I really love the language of finding that safe space there. I feel like that resonates with a lot of folks who may have had a similar safe space. I'm seeing Marge in the chat saying, I was always into sports, so I always felt included as part of the team. Um, I would love to get maybe one more person, or if other folks would like to share, I won't cut anyone off, but maybe starting with one more person coming off of mute, sharing in the chat.
I saw Carol raising her hand there. Or were you waving at someone? Or Kay, I saw you bring your hand up. I think you're on mute, Kay.
I do that once a meeting. I'm a parent of a trans gender son. So thinking about as myself as a kid is it's just been wiped out by being a parent. So but what I was going to comment on sports, and the thing that is bad and negative about excluding trans girls is what I experienced growing up is that we weren't able to participate. So you missed that aspect of working, playing, being a team player, meeting other kids. That we didn't have that in my school. I had to do water ballet or cheerleading or modern dance, period, none of which I was good at. But I'm just commenting that I think excluding, being able to exclude trans children and intersex children from sports is doing them such harm because it's such a great experience for those kids. So I didn't specifically answer your question, but I was just commenting.
I appreciate that, Kay. And you were actually ahead of the curve there because we're going to get into that point about how to relate your story to talking about trans rights specifically in this next slide. I do also want to name, as you mentioned, kind of your experience as a parent maybe being more at the forefront than your experience when you were younger. When we're talking about stories, we can talk about our own stories or our own experiences. We can also talk about if our family members are okay with it, our friends are okay with it, the experiences of other people in our lives. And so being able to, as I mentioned, talk about young people's experience as a parent of a trans kid can be incredibly, incredibly impactful. I'm seeing Carol in the chat mentioning not being able to unmute. Matt and Jill, I'm not sure if you were able to kind of unmute somebody on your end. Okay, if not. Oh, that might also be there's background noise kind of a message. Apologies.
I think I got unmuted finally. Thank you. I went to school, I went to a private girls' school, and most of the girls there were from one side of town, and they were always, they were pretty rich and they had debutante type things. And I just remember, feeling really different from them. I was really grateful that we had uniforms at our school because I came from a working class family and we didn't have very much in my family. And I can remember there would be certain times during the year where you could wear your street clothes to school. And those were the days that I always dreaded. But when I look back on the experience, I don't think it was the other kids that made me feel like I didn't belong. It was some kind of an internal thing where I was comparing myself to where they came from and what they had and where I came from and what I had. But so I did always, I did find my crew eventually in the school, but I think it was my own stuff that I brought with me in that comparison that made it more difficult for me to fit in.
Mm, thank you so much for sharing that, Carol. And I want to say, especially, that I really appreciate folks being willing to share about their own lives, share about their own experience. Um, Something that I've thought about a lot in having these kinds of conversations and getting into the practice of talking about my own life and my own experience is that it often feels a lot, at least for myself, in a lot of ways, it can feel safer or more secure to be able to lean back on facts or numbers or immediately pivoting and cutting someone off in conversation and saying, well, you're wrong because X, Y, and Z. For a lot of us, that is sometimes our first instinct, especially when these kinds of issues are close to our heart. And also being able to talk about our stories, being able to share things that may be a little bit vulnerable or that may demonstrate a little bit of who we are as people opens up so many more conversational pathways and so much more space for connection with people who are maybe in that space of being curious but being unsure, or having concerns but being open to learning more. So thank you all for sharing about that. And if folks have other kind of stories or thoughts on this front, feel free to drop them in the chat as well. I am going to ask for, let's say, at least one or two people to follow up or practice the second step here, which is as we're talking about our own experiences, as we're talking about our own lives, practicing what it looks like to say, an experience that shaped my life was, for me, that would be being in youth orchestra and being able to be messy and uncertain, but being able to grow alongside other people. And I really want trans kids and especially trans athletes to be able to also feel messy and uncertain and try new things and feel imperfect, but feel supported by the people around them. I had someone in a workshop I was in the other day say, I want trans kids to feel cool. Or I was, I was a soccer goalie when I was younger, and being able to wear the goalie shirt just made me feel so cool. And I just want trans kids to also feel cool. And that was a really lovely moment, just kind of close to my heart. Yeah, but I would love to invite, let's say, maybe one or two people to practice a little bit of a couple sentences on an experience that shaped my life was, and then following up with, I want trans kids to have access to that same sense of community and belonging. Don't need to use these words specifically, just that general framework.
Okay, this is not, I apparently don't follow instructions. My head doesn't go that way. Uh, my trans son has really shaped my life because I didn't know much about the world of gender, the world of sex, and because he has become so much more himself since he became who he wants to be. So, what I would say is, I would want trans people, trans kids, to be able to be who they are. And it took me a long time, growing up in a possibly dysfunctional family, to be able to be who I was. And it's wonderful to me to watch him be able to be who he is.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Kay. That was that was really lovely, and I want to especially highlight the things that are things that are wonderful, things that are leading with leading with the positives and leading towards the world that we're building towards or what we want for our family members, which is it's really lovely to get to see the people around us become who they are. Um, that was a really lovely example. I think I'm going to kind of move us past this slide since I know we've been on Zoom for an hour, and I do think folks had already kind of started to touch on this point in that first slide. But I would encourage you to practice a little bit of what it looks like to identify, experiences that were central to your lives, experience things that you may have in common with the people that you're talking about, and then just as Kay did just now, naming this is what I want for trans people in my community. This is what I want for my friends, my family members, and practicing in the mirror if that's what it takes. So thank you all again for sharing about your lives, for talking about your experiences. I know that that can be hard on a Zoom call, especially. I want to kind of close this out here and then we'll have a few minutes for questions. But I want to close this out by specifically naming that having these kinds of conversations can be hard, and you're not always going to be able to change someone's position in the course of the conversation. There's a trans educator named Rebecca Kling who says, it is never your responsibility to make yourself unsafe to win people over, and we're never going to win this without risk, and we have to decide what level of risk that we're each comfortable with. And I believe that all of us do really have people in our lives who we can move, whether that's, again, our family, our coworkers, our faith communities, people that we run into at the grocery store. And there's not always, there's not one word or one kind of singular sentence you can say that will always change people's minds. If there was, this would be an email instead of a meeting. So being patient with yourself as you're having these conversations, keeping yourself safe, especially if you are talking about family members or people close to your heart, but thinking about what level of having hard conversations makes sense for you all. All right, thank you all so much for sitting with me through this. I'm going to move this to this slide right here so folks can take down my contact information, which again, you will also be getting in a follow-up email. And I also want to invite folks to come off of mute, type in the chat, ask any questions that may have come up, or even just comments is fine.
Can I be controversial?
Sure.
No, that's not really, it shouldn't be controversial, but discussions I have, and I'm with the League of Women Voters and I advocacy, I mean, I'm starting that group for LGBTQ. But what I find is mostly, and what my job is, or what I think it is just to at least educate, gently educate people. Where I get the most pushback, and since this is about faith voices, I get the most pushback, no matter how gently I approach it or how from the people who say it's the Bible that governs their attitude towards trans, towards gay. And that's it. And then the conversation like stops. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, those are really tricky question or really tricky conversations to have, and I want to really validate that I've felt that as well in some conversations. Um, yeah, I, I'm curious if anyone else in the room has things that have worked for them, recognizing that you all are also in faith communities, things that have worked for them when it comes to having conversations where the conversation cuts off at that point.
Yeah, I can I can feel a lot of what you're saying. I have a trans son as well, and have been deeply involved in my faith community and leadership in all sorts of ways over my adulthood. I think for me, I appreciate Kate this conversation because I think proximity matters a lot, and so I do think the closer we can get ourselves to this story, the better. And so those of us who do have family members or however close, and I like how Kate mentioned how can we bring ourselves into the story. But Kate, the what I always use is I think most people would argue that the Bible teaches a lot about love and loving our neighbor and even loving our enemies. And so, when people want to be so hateful or so closed off to our trans or our queer community, I guess that's where I try to. I'm no expert on the Bible, but I know that the Bible talks a lot about loving everyone, and that's always where I try to draw people toward. So I don't know if that helps a lot. I found that I will say this, I found the exact same thing. And actually, because of my child, I've lost a lot of friends or people who I used to call friends. So I think you're in good company. I think a lot of us have that same feeling towards certain faith communities. But I will say this, I have since met so many amazing Christian people in communities that are very affirming of all people. And I think that's what I lean into because if I don't lean into that, then I couldn't even call myself a Christian anymore, I don't think so.
Thank you, Matt. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that we're not all staring at the screen. Hello, all. I think we have maybe 1 or 2 more minutes, so I'll ask if there's maybe one other question, and then if not, that's okay. And I'm going to be, again, sending out information after this as well. All right, I will, I think, let folks go then. Part of my college experience was during the pandemic, so I have a really high tolerance for awkward silences, I think. But please do feel free to reach out over email if you have any follow-up questions. And thank you all so much for being here and for sharing about your experiences, and to Matt for having me.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And again, if you have any questions, don't feel afraid to reach out. We'd be happy to set up a conversation or keep this conversation going, I should say. So, special thanks to Kate and Mallery for joining us, and we look forward to connecting more in the future. Have a great afternoon, everyone.